It's 6 years since the UK voted to leave the EU. It did so 51.9% to 48.1%, a vote that seemed to represent several decades of a fractious relationship between Britain and the European Union. The EU on one side, apparently on a journey to federalism, and the UK on the other, digging its heels in along the way. So maybe it was no surprise that those voting leave did so on the basis that in the UK we'd have control of our democracy, borders and waters. We'd also have control of our own money, and in doing so would help us level up across the country. We'd also be free to trade with other faster growing areas of the world, and to cut red tape, and to regulate in a way that would be good for British businesses, and so ultimately put money back in the pockets of us hard-working people. How's the scorecard? Well, Simon French joins us now from Panmure Gordon. Simon, it's great to be able to catch up with you. You're MD there at Panmure, and I know also chief economist. So I'd like, if I can, to ask you from a business point of view and also from an economic point of view about your thoughts on where we are, what we've been through, and what the options are for us here.
Well, hello, Jeremy, and thank you for the invite to converse about this. I think it's a good opportunity, isn't it, 6 years on, to take stock of where the UK economy has gone to. And I think it's worth putting some caveats out there up front, which is that through the last 6 years, we have had a global pandemic. We have had some significant economic turbulence at a global level preceding that with the trade war. So any very, very firm conclusions on inflation, on growth, on trade, on investment have to be tempered with the amount of noise in the data. But if we can start by just taking stock, we estimate, my own economic analysis estimates, the UK economy is about 3% smaller today than it would have been had it voted to remain in the European Union in 2016. And that is principally through two routes. Business investment is down about 15%, that's equivalent to about £60 billion a year on its pre-referendum trend. And that is very, very clear in the data, a decoupling of UK business investment after 2016. The second element is trade with the European Union, which all trade data is quite noisy, and the aforementioned factors are very relevant there. But there's been a faster recovery in trade since after the pandemic with the rest of the world, which is one of the advantages, it has to be said, of Brexit, but a very sluggish rebound in trade with the European Union, suggesting that those non-tariff barriers are weighing on economic output. Now, to take to your second part of the question, where from here? Well, I think it's worth putting on record that my own view prior to the referendum was that the economic case for the UK was better suited inside the European Union than outside. I'm unapologetic for that, and I think the evidence has supported that since. But trying to make the most of the advantages that Brexit provides, whilst not hamstringing British businesses, I think is the priority, has to be the priority right now. And I think there are some interesting discussions going on now at political level about what options are available to the UK should it choose, as the political heat hopefully starts to at least cool a little, whether the single market and customs union membership as part of EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, countries like Norway involved with that, whether the UK, that could be a viable path for us in the future.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because along the way, we've seen all sorts of ebbing and flowing of views from within the European Union, it has to be said, as well as here in the UK. Of course, it's well known on this side of the channel that we had Gordon Brown refusing at one point to bow to pressure from within his own party back in the early 2000s, where he was saying it wouldn't be a good idea to join the euro. Now, he was seen at the time to be one of the heroes of this idea that we weren't going to move down this federalist route. Jacques Delors wanting famously to move Europe very fast into a federalist state. And of course, we've now seen subsequent to that, I think it was 2012, Jacques Delors admitting that the UK was probably better off outside the EU. And he said, I think at the time we'll be friends. Now, clearly, not, as there has been a fair amount of this acrimony around Brexit from the EU camp, mostly because the EU is going to find it difficult to bridge the gap in funding left, I think, by the UK's departure. Does the EU have a problem without the UK, do you think? Do you think deep down they would accept the UK back on some sort of friendly single market terms? Or do you think the acrimony is such that retracing some of that ground that we lost during the Brexit period, we're never going to be able to reclaim?
I don't think that acrimony is real. I think it is somewhat confected for domestic audiences, be it Emmanuel Macron, probably the most vocal in France, but other European Union leaders. And we have to recognise, I think, sometimes we, residing as we do in the UK, that the sort of political jingoism, if you like, is something unique to us. It's not. It's present across all developed economies and developing economies at the moment. And therefore, I wouldn't suggest that there is a structural barrier to the UK in time taking a closer relationship with the European Union than one it has under the trade and cooperation agreement that voided a no deal at the end of the Brexit negotiation phase. I think you mentioned some really interesting stuff there around the Eurozone, the single currency area, and what that, in order to function correctly, requires in terms of federal fiscal policy, more devolved powers, competencies to Brussels in order to have a single way of operating a broad-based economic system with a single currency and a single monetary policy. I think that was always a friction since Gordon Brown, through the 5 tests that you had in the Treasury, decided not to take the UK into the euro. And actually, although I said earlier in this podcast that I was in favour of Remain, I do fully recognise that there were actually, over the longer term future, some really fundamental questions whether an economy of the UK size could stay inside the European Union, but outside the Eurozone in that uncomfortable friction. I think my frustration, if you like, with the way the debate took place in the run-up to the referendum was that some people who honestly should have known better were not prepared to acknowledge that political friction, which I think everybody, Remain or Leave, could acknowledge was there. In order to avoid that, you had to take some fairly substantive economic pain, and we're seeing that economic pain play out over the last 6 years.
You covered quite neatly the idea that possibly some might be suggesting that joining the single market may be a good idea. I know that Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative member for Bournemouth East, as an MP, I think he said recently that the UK should rejoin the single market. And I know something as well, going back to history, if you read the books accurately, I think Margaret Thatcher certainly wanted access to this single market. And that was as far as she was concerned, I think the cornerstone of this engagement with Europe. And I think if you go back further, history suggests that Winston Churchill saw this as the foundation of common ground amongst all Europeans. And it would be, I think, perhaps possibly maybe wrong to overlay history from that far ago into where we are today to work out precisely what was meant at the time. But nonetheless, many people do see the single market as a massive advantage. Do you think that there might be some sort of Tobias Ellwood-led initiative to take us back into agreeing to drop borders for goods, the free flow of goods and services and so forth? Or do you think that is all now far too gone?
I don't think it's too far gone. It's an excellent question. I don't think we're too far gone. I just think that there is still, it's a very politically raw situation. And I think if you like, the generation, the cohort of leaders, both in the UK and the EU, probably need to change. And more water, if you excuse the metaphor, more water needs to pass through the channel before such point that the UK and the EU would be prepared to consider that. But I do think from an economic standpoint, it is a potentially attractive option. I think maybe this is the opportunity just to briefly talk about what that famous campaigning slogan, taking back control, actually means. And I think it's really important for listeners to, and I don't want to patronize listeners. I think what I want to explain is that from an economic standpoint, having control over your borders, your rulemaking, is very appealing rhetorically, but the practicalities of it on a day-to-day basis, and I talk about this from having spent more than a decade working in the civil service in the UK government, is that you go out and you talk to households and businesses about how they want their economy regulated, what laws, rules they want to follow. And invariably they say, look, we want to align ourselves with our closest economic and social partners to minimize the friction. And therefore, while it is appealing, if you study the politics of it, to have that theoretical control, when the rubber hits the road, in practicality, when you're regulating on industries, on social affairs, there's much greater alignment, much greater alignment than perhaps justifies having complete sovereignty over all those decisions, because most of the time you wouldn't actually use it, because you would align yourself with your biggest economic and social partner, which is the EU in the UK's case.
To get good economic policy, you have to have good political leadership. And I know that going back to the voting disparity at the time, England took the majority. Northern Ireland voted 55% to remain, it has to be said, and Scotland, I think, a whopping 62% to remain in the EU. Now, leadership can go a long way, I think, in helping repair this sort of regional disparity. And certainly something that seems to be lacking at the moment. As an economist, do you think that it's a truism to say that economic modelling has to be led by a strong political governorship? I mean, is this something you feel that you are not getting as someone that wants to follow what might be regarded as sensible economic policy? Or do you think that there's a big gap here?
Well, another cracking question, and there's a really important aspect to all of this, which is for 20, 30, probably 40 years, the Western economies, the UK included, have pursued to a greater or lesser extent what I would describe as quite laissez-faire capitalism. And the reality is we are now on the cusp of some very, very significant industrial changes, partly as a result of demographic shifts, partly as a result of technology shifts, partly the result of climate change. And I think the British businesses are fairly agnostic on things such as the marginal tax rate. They're fairly agnostic on some of the, if you like, the sort of more cultural things that this government has to do, perhaps to be popular. But it is frustrated by a lack of consistency of what I would describe as an industrial strategy. Something that codifies how the UK is going to, transition to those new technologies in order to hit its net zero achievements, how it is going to afford a state that, because of an aging population, is going to become far more expensive than it is today. And it's not just about codifying those, because the governments and successive governments in the last decade or so have tried this, but these strategies have never lasted more than 18 months, 2 years. They've changed from the industrial strategy to the plan for jobs, to the plan for growth, the levelling up plan. They get rebranded, they get changed, they get a new emphasis. And the problem is, if you're an entrepreneur, business, trying to, if you look at your counterparty as the government and trying looking for a consistent counterparty, I'm afraid you have to say you're looking at that and saying this is a pretty inconsistent counterparty. Despite the merits of some of those plans, they haven't been around long enough, people for private capital to want to crowd in those public sector plans with their own cash flows.
So where do you see all this moving then? As you correctly pointed out at the top, it might be 6 years since the vote, but it's only been 2.5 years since Brexit was implemented at the back end of January 2020. So we haven't really, to be fair, had that much of a crack at it yet in the full workings of the whole thing. It was a period, of course, when we were going to be ramping up into this brave new world of new trade ideas and trade relationships and so forth. And unfortunately, COVID has got in the way of much of that, it has to be said. But where do you see things developing? And do you think it would be dangerous to possibly maybe see a new government coming in 2 or 3 years' time with on a political platform to try and re-establish some sort of link once again with the EU and possibly deeper into the workings of the EU. Do you think that would be as a difficult move? Do you think it would be the wrong move? Where do you see the future evolving for us in the UK?
Well, I'm going to sidestep the merits or otherwise of a particular government,
Mhm.
but I would say that a change of government introduces, and it's very clear in the data, a degree of uncertainty, which has a chilling effect on business investment. And certainly, if a government changed with a very different um, sort of view regarding its external relationship with the European Union, that would lead to some short-term uncertainty. But of course, we are, despite the fact we are now into its 12th year of Conservative government, over that period, there have been what we talk, we're onto the fourth version of that government. And that in of itself is, even though if you like, the colour of the government hasn't changed, there has been considerable uncertainty over a period that might, at least to the external observer, say, well, you've had political stability there. It certainly hasn't felt like that. And I think if you layer on that further, then that moment where business investment feel confident to crowd back in just moves further to the right.
Interesting. Okay, look, Simon, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much indeed for your time, gauging the reaction and the market moves since Brexit. Thank you. That was Simon French, Chief Economist and MD at Panmure Gordon. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.